Hey, welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics, or are your politics starting to shape your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our four panelists for today. First, we have Dr. Andrew Polk, Associate Professor of History at Middle Tennessee State University and the author of the critically acclaimed book, Faith and Freedom, Propaganda, Presidential Politics, and the Making of an American Religion. We also have with us Dr. Nia Johnson, who's Assistant Professor of Law at Wake Forest Law School. We also have with us Judith Hawkins, who's a former judge and attorney in Tallahassee, Florida. And we have Mr. Rashawn Baker, who's the president and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group and a University of Maryland professor of public policy. Ladies and gentlemen, good having you here with us. Looking forward to our show today. You know, there was an interesting story I read about a Catholic public school teacher who was reportedly suspended for refusing to remove her cross from beside her desk. She's a public school teacher in Connecticut. She's Catholic and was allegedly suspended and threatened with termination after refusing to remove a crucifix beside her desk, according to her legal representatives. What we have here is Liberty Institute, who represents a lot of individuals who have religious liberty issues, and Wilmer Hale, which is really a very large law firm in Washington, D.C. They fired off a letter to the school system in New Britain telling them that you cannot do this to tell somebody what they can't have because it violates their constitutional rights. And as a result thereof, we find ourselves in a court system now fighting about the fact that someone wants to show up with a crucifix that's in a public school system, and therefore this person is now being threatened with suspension without pay, and she's been placed also on administrative leave. You know, Nia, when we see these type of matters that are happening, which seems to be threatening more and more individuals based on their religious beliefs as opposed to where they are in the public square, the real question is, legally, is there a way that we can find less of this happening, or is it just simply the culture war we're in? We're just going to see more of this happening?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, what's very interesting about this situation is the fact that they say that other teachers had religious artifacts on their desk. We also don't seem to see any indicator that she's like proselytizing to her students either, which is something we do talk about a fair amount on this show, right? People using their workplaces as spaces to, engage in religious evangelism and other things. It seemed like it was just a personal item that she had on her desk. And it begs, a number of questions. Like, what if it was a picture frame that had a cross on it, right? Like, would that be considered the same as having the cross on her desk immediately? Are we having an institution where nobody can have any sort of religious paraphernalia on their desk in the view of the students? And that is also a reasonable approach to take, right? These are teachers. They're not necessarily in a separate office away from their coworkers or their students. They are in front of their students on a regular basis. But I think, looking at this in the form of a culture war, I think what's really unfortunate about this is something I've also spoken about on this show before, which is that, not to use a slang term, but I think there are some folks who are looking to get their lick back on Christian populations. These are groups that have spent a lot of time telling people what to do, telling people how to live, pushing people out of their congregations. And so now you have folks, when they find, opportunities to let people know you can't really tell us what to do, they're fighting back. And it's really difficult for me to, say on one hand that the woman here who obviously, I think is having her religious freedom, constricted, even though I'm not a First Amendment scholar. But I will also say, as much as that is meaningful, there's also something to be said about the dissent that's kind of brewing underneath that can perpetuate something like this. And that's also important.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. The way you phrase this at the beginning, Orlin, of the culture wars, I do think that's what we're seeing increasingly, right? That we're trying to figure out a new orientation of what religious freedom is, of discrimination, what that means, and who can for reasons, right? This is, in some sense, more up in the air with this current Supreme Court than it has been in a while. So I think we get a lot of these cases that in some sense are test cases, right? They're making points and they're trying to prove. My worry about all of this, and I've said this over and over on the show, and I'm sure I will continue to, is that people fall by the wayside This woman wasn't proselytizing. She wasn't making her students pray to the crucifix. It was her personal item. That's incredibly clear by the facts of the case. That's a living human being with her personal item. I wish we would stop taking people and throwing them under buses to prove points. But I'm not sure any of those people actually are caring about what's happening.
I guess maybe I've got a totally different take on it. First of all, I had an opportunity to listen to the interview that was done with her. She's a 32-year seasoned teacher. And they also showed the cross. It's not on her desk. It's beside her desk, almost like on a bulletin board. And in her interview, she spoke of how the children would ask her what it is, what it was, what it is, and how she would explain to them, basically using that cross, that crucifix, to teach her religious doctrine. Also, it bothered me greatly as I listened to one of the lawyer from First Liberty Institute make the statement that the teachers considered that their private space, and they had all kinds of things there, secular things and so on and so forth, and that so surely sacred things or religious things could be put in the space. And as I listened to that, I thought, well, wait a minute here. We're trying to compare apples and zucchini. The public school is public school. And I'm a strong proponent that in a public space like a public school, there really ought not be any backdoor way of, you use the word proselytizing, evangelizing, but being able to indoctrinate children of anything other than just, everybody has equal standing, but not for religious purposes. And that I think we're in a place now where it's very clear that separation of church and state is actually eroding. And the cases that we've seen before and the cases that are right now before the Supreme Court, and as we'll talk about in another segment, they are test cases. And the Supreme Court is leaning very, very heavily toward blurring, if not totally erasing the line between church and state. So the question is, who really is pushing these cases? It may look like those who are objecting are pushing it, but the truth be told, I think the benefit goes to the other side, because when the court comes down, as I predict that it will, on her side, now we are opening up the public space so that children whose parents have, or who are being reared with totally different religious orientations, are being subjected to other religious points of view. And I think that when we look at it very narrowly, it's not going to bode well.
So, Sharon, how do you look at this when on one hand you have someone to say, well, I've just got this thing here, but on the other hand, someone says, well, actually, you've kind of got that thing hoping somebody will ask you about that thing. And when they ask you about that thing, then it begins. How do you know when somebody's just, quote unquote, preparing or trying to create an environment so that they can talk about their religious belief, as opposed to that's just simply what they have? One person describes it as being a small cross. Somebody may describe it as being, almost something that you would have sitting that looks like a statue of some sort. How do you fight this fight, or do we ever get to a conclusion?
I think all the panelists are right. And I think the problem has now become, and I think the judge just said it, and that is, we've now blurred the line between separation of church and state more towards church and a particular type of religion. And when you see cases like this, which seem on the surface just to be, hey, this is my individual space. This is just what I have here. This is my desk. I don't have a desk somewhere else. And it's just there, as opposed to someone who's hoping that people will ask about it. And I think really it's where we've gone wrong in this country, and we're going down that slippery slope. And that is, in the past, we'd have looked at this and looked at the behavior of the individual there. Is this something that's just there? And this person is just like I have many items on my desk. It's just one of many. Or is this there for a reason? So in a past, time, we would have looked at the action of the individual. And now I think something else the judge said was absolutely correct. The other side wants these cases to come before the Supreme Court because they figure how it's going to act, how it's going to rule, how they're going to rule. And what I want to see happens is when the person who has, a Buddhist symbol on their desk and children are asked, what is this? Who is this person? And there's a conversation, and then that case rises to the Supreme Court. Is it treated the same way as this one? But I think it's because we have gone down a road that we should not have gone, and put us in this situation.
Well, and I would also like to add, going back to Judge Hawkins' points, I think this is exactly, really correct and really important. But then we also need to look to the other branches of government and such to act as well. So let's say, this isn't, this woman is proselytizing from her desk, and the Supreme Court works in rules in her favor if this is meant to be a test case before the Supreme Court, or even the, the local courts in Connecticut. The Connecticut state legislature could just pass something that says, well, no. If you are a publicly funded place, if you are in a school with children, because children are vulnerable, you can't have any sort of religious paraphernalia at your desk, right? It's almost like when we were in elementary school, if one toy causes the whole classroom problems, then all the toys got to go. And no one can have any toys in their desk, right? And so this is something that the legislature can do as well. And it's not like the Connecticut state legislature would have a ton of trouble passing this either, right? So, there's opportunities to protect a number of different aspects of religious freedom. And that's why you do need the three branches of government to involve themselves at different stages.
So, Andrew, it sounds like that's the real issue here. Maybe the three branches aren't working properly. So all the other branches that feel that there's a void try to jump in. And it seems like we're seeing more of that in the court system now than any place else.
I think it's at least true that people often don't think that all the branches are going to do it, right? That's why these cases keep going to the courts, because the courts somehow have a definitive answer to this, when exactly as Dr. Johnson said, there's a whole lot of other ways to do these types of things.
Yeah.
They seem to be more reasonable. I think the crux of this that's going to come up is Judge Hawkins noted, is how do we define evangelism or proselytizing? Right? This comes up often in cases when parents object to their children learning about the pillars of Islam or ancient Buddhism because they're proselytizing, and you're teaching them in 6th grade when they learn. No, they're just learning about it. So if these kids ask her about the crucifix and she says, well, it's a symbol of my faith, I'm a Christian, I'm a Catholic, this represents Jesus, that's different than saying, well, that's Jesus who died for your sins so that you may have life. Like, that's a different conversation. And I think those distinctions do matter. We can't just lump that together. So the details do matter in the way that these play out. At least they should, I think.
And my comment is, so who's going to script that the teachers are going to stick to just giving a historical or factual explanation? I don't think so. If it's important enough to me, well, in this case, if it's important enough to this teacher who has for 10 years had this crucifix there, then that's a part of her life. And I don't see how I'm going to be able to give you an objective, factual statement without adding some emotional response to it.
Of course you could. We could describe our faith without trying to get people to adhere to it. Of course you can do that, Judge Hawkins. We all do it all the time.
Well, the catch is, though, you're always planting seeds. And this thing about impact and the consequences and harvest is important. Many people will trace back their religious conversions to what looked like a benign conversation.
Well, and I think that's the problem that we're dealing with here. Who determines what is benign conversation? Who determines what is problematic? Who determines the script and whether or not the script actually is what is going to be quote unquote legal? And I think that's why we find ourselves in courts on this on a regular basis, and probably will be for some time to come. There's an interesting case in Oklahoma, and it's called the Oklahoma Statewide Virtual Charter School case. And that case actually has a few different parties. It has the Drummond party, but it also has the St. Isidore of Seville Catholic Virtual School as a party. But the real issue that's going on here is that the Oklahoma Archdiocese had planned to open the St. Isidore of Seville Catholic Virtual School for a particular school year with about 200 students. But the Oklahoma Supreme Court ruled 7-1 that using public dollars for a religious school would violate the First Amendment prohibition on government making a law respecting an establishment of a religion. In this particular ruling, we have one of the justices that basically mentioned in their dissenting opinion that they argued that to block the school solely because it was religious would actually violate the First Amendment's guarantee of religious freedom. Judge Harkins, what we see happening here in this case is one of those battles where people who practice law understand that how I shape the argument and what are the tenets that I use to win is the most important part of what's going on here. And this is one of those cases where, are we talking about violation of the First Amendment, or are we talking about something as it relates to the Establishment Clause, or are we talking about something that has to do more with structure of these organizations as opposed to anything else? As somebody who has sat on the bench and probably had to parse through a lot of this looks like the proverbial case with a number of moving parts that looks like it should have a simple answer.
This is the Trojan horse. And I think it is a very, very, very important case. This case, and it looks like the ruling may go in favor of the school, basically now takes a whole. I mean, no, it's more than a whole. It destroys. It fundamentally destroys the separation of church and state and public schools. Before, charter schools, or up to this point, charter schools have all been private. Now, what they're proposing is that this Catholic school literally becomes a part of the public school system, and that the children who attend this Catholic public school will be indoctrinated with Catholic doctrine and will be expected to adhere to it. So I hope I'm not too far afield, but if we destroy the Department of Education, which is basically for public schools, who is going to educate our children? And now that this case is basically saying that religious schools that are actively proselytizing and evangelizing these students, these young children, are going to be expected to adhere to those church doctrines. And I think this is a door that once it's open, America will never be the same. I feel very strongly about this case. So we can disguise it any way we want to, but when you get down to the bottom line, this case is critical to where America is going with its combination or its blending of church and state. It is an important case.
I totally agree with the judge. I think this is probably one of the most important cases we're going to see in the next several years, especially what's going on at the federal level. It hit me on this case because I actually serve on a board with the Attorney General from Oklahoma's wife. And one of the things that we've always noted in the board meetings is how conservative the Attorney General is. And the Attorney General in this case is actually opposing the school. So that surprised me in the beginning. But then when I look at where it's going, you had, and we do things called public charter school. That's a new thing that started maybe about 8 years ago. And we actually have them here in Maryland and Prince George's County, which was designed to make it public as a regular public school, but it's a charter form. Mm-hmm. This is that. The public charter school, and makes it a private religious public charter school that they can do virtually everything they were doing in the Catholic school. And that's why this is so important. If I was a conspiracy theorist, I would think that the Attorney General purposely, brought this up so it could go to the Supreme Court and it could rule so that we change the face of public education in this country. I'm deeply concerned about it and worried about this case. So I agree totally with the judge on this one.
Well, and I'll also add to this. I mean, this is also a theme that has come up in many other cases we've talked about on this show, which is that, the religious institutions are trying to step in and fill a policy gap, and that's how they're coercing people to be comfortable with those, with their presence. And this isn't necessarily new, right? If we think about religious schools that get school vouchers, so that way children who are in public schools can transfer and be a part of, private institutions. Many of those private institutions are religious, but the theory is that they are filling a need, right? The idea is that we cannot reform public schools, or we don't want to take the time to reform public schools, and people like parochial schools and private schools because they have smaller classroom sizes, they have more attentive teachers, and so it becomes something that's really tempting for individuals to do. I will say, as a bit of a bright spot, I am grateful that there seems to be a bit of holding of the line here, where people are saying, wait a minute, I don't think that this is exactly what is supposed to be happening, and also it is so blatant. But again, when we look for people to scapegoat in these type of cases or groups to push away in these type of cases, really often, one of the things that we just tend to see is that this is basically people pushing away the responsibility from the three branches of government to do their jobs, right? If the state of Oklahoma was actually, and I can't speak to their commitment level, but if they were actually reshaping public education, if at a national level we were actually worried about the quality of public education, we probably would not need religious institutions to enter the gap and try to address these issues. And I would also add, it behooves religious institutions to start thinking about holding the line on religious liberty for themselves. Right? Like, many of these religious institutions, they're just excited to be invited into places. And honestly, they're, lacking what I would argue is a bit of self-control, right? They're so excited to be in a space that they don't think about the consequences. And that's how you end up with, groups being persecuted that tend to be aligned with your faith. So it really can ricochet back and hit somebody quite often. And that's why we need these type of protections in place.
And I think the heart of this is the ambiguous nature of charter schools, right? I think I would argue intentionally ambiguous, right, as they came up. I think that was part of the design. But the question of, well, the Supreme Court has said if, say, the case, 2017, 2018, a religious school wants to repave their, or to put more safety, right, in their playground. And so if the state's giving to everyone, they have to give to religious schools. Well, here they argue, well, the public, this is not a public school, right? The public is there, but the public doesn't run it. The public isn't on the board. The public doesn't determine what it is. But on the other side, but it's a charter school, so it's not like a private school, and that it has to follow the exact same standards and policies and procedures as public schools. So is that public or private? I think the point is, yes, maybe, right? That this is supposed to have that somehow middle ground between these public and private issues, that this just doesn't count. Well, it clearly counts, right? Is Judge Hawkins, I think, eloquently put it, this matters tremendously of our understanding of separation of church and state going forward. Like, there's no way to say this case doesn't matter. But the crux of it seems to be this strategy of, well, it's not simply public and it's not simply private. So come on, as Dr. Johnson said, the kids need it, right? And so we're going to supply it regardless of what that actually means.
And, I would like to jump in really quickly and also say what they're also missing in this case. I think it would behoove not just this Catholic institution, but many Christian institutions more broadly to understand this, is that this could also flip back on you very quickly as well. Like we talk about on this show, a number of different cases where you have religious institutions saying, well, we're just trying to do a good thing. And then they come across the wrong activist group who is much more savvy than they are, just like they're trying to be savvy here. And they're like, no, this is public. Like you come back, roll it back. You're not allowed to do these things. Mm-hmm. And so it actually shows up on both sides. But this is what I mean when I say it's a lack of self-control, right? There are many times where Christians feel so empowered by principles of evangelism that they think they can skirt the law because they have morality on their side. And they don't realize that these laws in place aren't here just to keep you from, quote unquote, doing the Lord's work. They're also here to protect you, because there are many different times where the courts will swing in the opposite direction and they'll be like, no, you cannot participate in this anymore. And then they want to cry religion. Yeah. Right. So we're not crying religion on the front, but we want to cry it on the back end.
But Judge Hawkins, I've heard Catholics say that, we were the original public schools. We were the ones that actually put these systems in place. This is more of just going back to the future, going back to where when we were in charge, public school was probably a whole lot better. Is that crazy talk?
Let me make two separate points here. That answer is when the Catholics was the public school, we also had serious religious persecution. But number two, the backstory, I got to come up with the backstory. When Mr. Franklin, I don't know if it's Dr. Franklin, but anyway, when this proposal was made to him, he never gave it a second thought. And he said something to the board that opposed it. And he said, I feel like this is so much bigger than this. What's going on? And the person said to him, yes, it is. And we will take it all the way to the Supreme Court. This idea grew out of the Notre Dame Liberty Clinic. So these are planned cases to take it to the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court, this current Supreme Court, is eroding the separation. And so particularly religious organizations, and right now a lot of these cases seem to be coming from the Catholic faith, they're just having an opportunity to railroad through or to destroy this separation. And it's just not going to end up well. Well, I don't think it's going to end up well in terms of what America was founded on, which was a country of no king and no pope.
Rashawn, what's your word on that?
I totally agree with the judge. I think one thing that we have to remember, actually working on legislation for public charter schools, is they have to follow everything that the public school does. This is for a particular purpose, something that the public school can't do on its own, a broader base. But you must follow the hiring practices, all the laws of the state. It is not meant to be a private school. It's not funding the private school. And that's the thing that was missed in this case. And so that's what we have to be mindful of.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but it looks as though we're gonna find ourselves at the Supreme Court really making a lot of judgment calls. And interestingly, we're starting to see Supreme Court justices recuse themselves from some of these decisions, which could make the matter even more confusing before it's all said and done. Hey, Andrew, tell me something I don't know.
Oh, my youngest child just told me this yesterday. The oldest and largest living organism in the world is an aspen grove in Utah. They look like separate trees. They are biologically, genetically exactly identical. They have a common root system. This organism is over 100 acres and has lived at least 80,000 years.
Wow, that child is reading well. Great. Judge Hawkins, tell me something I don't know.
Did you know that when at the Supreme Court that they put a white quill pen on the tables? It's a tradition dating back to the earliest days of the court. And while no one uses the quill pen, they take them as mementos.
Wow. Rashawn, tell me something I don't know.
So you probably know this, but I'll say it anyway. The fathers of religious freedom in the United States are Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. It would be interesting to see what they think of today's court.
Tell me something. Nia, tell me something I don't know.
So, did you know that in half of the Republican districts and also half of Democrat districts, a fourth of the people in those districts are on Medicaid? And so even though, this is the Medicaid issue is being framed as something that only applies to one group of people, the statistics say that that's not true.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, great conversation today. Looking forward to doing it again. And thanks again for you being here with us, and hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.